Hello, everyone. We're back to finish up, finally, Law and Revolution, the formation of the Western legal tradition by Harold Berman. It's been many months since me and Andrew and Caleb came together to talk about this book, and finally, we're going to finish it off with the sections on royal law. And as a special guest for this section on royal law, we have Jacob Hall here, who I don't think has appeared on the channel before, and he is working on his dissertation right now on particularly the English royalty and the way that it developed over the centuries, particularly, I guess, the idea of itinerant kingship, which actually comes up a little bit in the readings. And so we've split it up into 4 sections, one for each of us. And it starts off talking about the Norman kingdom of Sicily, which was right there on the Italian peninsula with the papacy. And Andrew's kind of got that a section assigned to him. So why don't you take it away and tell us what you thought was interesting? Give us a summary of the Norman kingdom of Sicily.
Great. Yeah, royal law in Sicily and England. So I understood the main point here to be that the separation of the spiritual and secular regions of life gave rise to a territorial conception of a secular ruling king, and the king as a lawmaker. And this led to a professionalization of administration, bureaucracy, and courts that paralleled and in some ways were influenced by papal authority and the structure of the church after the papal revolution. The chapter goes into giving examples from the kingdom of Sicily, the Normans in Sicily, and then Norman England. And there's a little bit on Norman England before Mr. Hall takes over. So yeah, what should I say about this? The Berman gives 9 points about how the king changed. He was no longer the supreme spiritual ruler, no longer a chief lord, but had authority to rule his subjects in his territorial domain, not just his clan. He was seen to have a role of keeping the peace and doing justice. He developed bodies of professional court and professional administrators. The king was seen as having the right and duty to legislate for the first time. He developed his own body of law, he being the king, not any particular king. And in political theory, there were constitutional constraints arising from a theory of law, right, and duty. And in political practice, the power of the king was limited by the power of various communities within the kingdom and the clergy. And finally, kings constituted an international professional elite. They kind of respected each other and they became focal by kind of being the powerful people who respected one another. Maybe some quick points. It was, I think, if I understand this correctly, the secular power or idea of royal law comes in consequence of the papal revolution through maybe 3 main ways. One, we talked about in an earlier meeting how there's kind of a dialectical defense of secular power that comes out of the separation of spiritual and secular regions. So the church says we're dominant in the spiritual region and not in the secular, and that's what gives us power. And then the secular says, okay, that means we have a domain and it has to be respected. And they use that theoretically to advance the idea of secular power. Secondly, there was competition between secular and ecclesiastical courts. And thirdly, emulation. And so just as a couple of examples, the idea of king as legislator is perhaps influenced or at least parallels Pope as legislator for the church. And the administrative structure, for example, the chancery comes to the Pope first. You have to administer the church, and kings are being influenced by that process and putting those kinds of things in place. Finally, interesting is law. If you want to, the thing that was most interesting to me again, and it kind of has come up before, is that if you want to rule by means of law, you as a king start creating theory and practice that limits you. So if you think I need to rule by means of law, you start to establish this thing called law, which philosophically can become the idea of rule of law. So if you're going to rule by law, then there's a possibility there's a rule of law. And also, if you're going to rule by means of an administrative apparatus, that administrative apparatus takes on a life of its own, separate from the person of the king, separate from the absolutism of the king. And those things can serve to constrain absolutism. So the two examples that people talked about are Roger II. The Normans go down to Italy as what's the word I'm looking for? Merchant soldiers. What's the one word term for that?
Mercenaries.
Mercenary.
Thanks. Great. Mercenaries. And they're just awesome, and they take over. And they take over Sicily too. Roger II is on page 419 described as the first modern prince who establishes a law of kind of royal law in the first sense. I understand Berman to be saying that the extreme cultural diversity of Greeks and Islamic cultures and others, I guess the Franks are there too, and the Italians, Lombards, I don't know, I forget who's on Sicily, but the extreme heterogeneity of culture means that there's no strong sense of law that unites everybody, and the king doesn't establish all the law, but he establishes a very strong sense of law to bring order to what's going on, and Berman is highly impressed. I don't know what more should be said about that. The other example is Henry II in England. So that both, he says that if Sicily had succeeded, if Norman Sicily had succeeded in being permanent, it was kind of after, I think, Frederick II, and the Normans lost power in Sicily. But he says if Sicily had remained, the kingdom of Sicily had remained to this day, we wouldn't really be talking about Norman England as the model as much as we'd be talking about Norman Sicily, because a lot of the precedents and what's impressive about Norman rule in England and Normandy came first in Sicily. Cultural and technical qualities of the Normans made them able to do these things, and there was also mutual influence and definitely some learning from Sicily, if not direct copy or imitation. So with that, I guess we should maybe open up to questions.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested. I didn't know too much about Sicily before reading this, and it seems like they are very much an early model of the rule by law and almost like an autocratic state, right? The way that we think of one today, but in the medieval era, right? And so I'm interested in what you said where okay, so a king wants to rule, like basic as a verb, he wants to rule, right? And one of the means of rule is there's either just going around and pushing people around, giving orders, right? Or by giving laws. And we can kind of make a distinction between orders and laws. Like orders is me telling you to do a particular thing, whereas a law is generally, I want you to act this way. And in this environment, rule by law is somewhat more efficient because you can create stable expectations, right? And you can maybe more efficiently communicate to your subjects the way in which you want them to act, backed up by force, of course, right? But it's the whole advantage of ruling by law is that you yourself are acting in a somewhat stable way. And so I'm really interested, and I was curious if we could tease out why rule by law would eventually lead to rule of law, where the king himself, even though he's the one that's initially writing up these laws and ruling by them, they end up constraining him to some degree because he has to actually meet the expectations that he set, or else he's sort of damaging his ability to rule by law in the future, right? Or for his descendants to rule by law in the future. That's what I sort of took out of what you just said, Andrew.
Yeah, let me just say, in the way you phrased it though, Berman in the conclusion says it wasn't inevitable. He actually says it's possible that you could have autocratic rule by law and not have achieved this other thing. And so it's not like an automatic evolution. The ideas and other things have to be in play, and that's why so much of the papal revolution is important for him, because all these things are coming together. But yeah, what makes it possible or likely to go from this rule by law to rule of law? And maybe what happened, why did it specifically happen in the Western legal tradition?
One idea, and my touchstone is like Magna Carta, so I'll use Magna Carta as an example, is we sort of issue, and Magna Carta is issued and the king has to follow it. And he sort of had, like, he's constrained now. And one of the things, like, on the table, on the bargaining table, is like, okay, barons, you have to hold, like, part of holding up your end of the bargain is holding up a version of Magna Carta for your own vassals. And so if the king is sort of going around and saying, like, look, you're treating your vassals poorly and you're doing all this stuff, one way to get them to treat their vassals better is to treat them better. So by submitting to Magna Carta, you're getting them to also submit to their own little version of Magna Carta. So something like that. There's some dynamic going on there as well with the issuing of further legislation, not just the charter. One thought, this came up sort of, I have two big questions for this whole chapter. The first is, it seems that particularly royal law is increasing in developing and becoming further rationalized, particular like in the 11th and 12th century. And I'm trying to like, well, why? What's sort of the cause behind that? And you touched on a little bit of it. Another further question is, what's up with the Normans? Like, the Normans play a big part of this story. It's not like, oh, they're sort of happening, you know, at different places. Like the Normans being from that little place in Normandy where they're all like culturally and linguistically homogenous, and then going out, the explanation has something to do with them. The Normans are important. It's not just some other like, oh, there's some technological innovation that is propelling increased rationalization.
I mean, the first question is somewhat answered by the thesis of the rest of the book, that it's something about what happened in the revolution in the church is what's inspiring and allowing for the rationalization of royal law. But the Normans particularly are a strange question. And related to the question of the Normans is just the basic fact that this is related to a paper that I just wrote with Gabriel Benzacri, which is the idea that that the Normans are the only kingdom that really develops in the Italian peninsula throughout the Middle Ages. And they're also the only one that it seems like the Pope cannot put a check on, because they're the ones who have the lowest costs to invading and attacking the Pope directly in Rome, right? And the paper that I wrote with Gabriel said that when the papacy moved to Avignon, basically that same relationship developed between the French king and the Pope, such that the Pope was able to arrest the Templars without much punishment from the Pope, right? So that this geographic location and the nature of the Norman kingdom of Sicily, I think, also map well. But Caleb, I think you had something.
Yeah, one thing that I found kind of interesting in this section, and it shows up throughout the rest of the sections that we were talking about, is it seems kind of clear how the papal revolution leads to this separation of the secular and the religious domains, and this kind of like keeping out of each other's domains, and how the systematization happens within the ecclesiastical domains. But what's kind of interesting, and I've missed it, but something that I think Berman maybe underspecifies that's worth digging into a little bit is how the transformations actually take place in the secular realm and why that's the case. So like in the case of the Normans, or in any of the other people that we talk about, there's these now secular kings don't have the authority to interfere with ecclesiastical appointments, and they are no longer, like, they're cut out of that sphere. But then Berman talks about how that leads them to like filling these other new roles, where they start, instead of just being judges of some kind of customary law, they're creating their own laws, and they're creating their own laws as a lawgiver. And this requires the setting up of an apparatus, and a legal apparatus, and these legal apparati, I don't know, require more advanced systems of taxation, because now you have to pay these people who are in your legal system. And so there's this huge structural change. And I get why there's motivation for that to happen, but I don't understand maybe why that wasn't happening previously. So what was restraining kings previously from creating laws? Why did they stick with customary law for so long? And then what became attractive about the systematization of laws that was possible in the canon law? And then if they needed this more sophisticated tax structure to be able to actually support the more developed forms of royal law, why weren't they like employing these tax structures before? Is it something about the nature of the law code that makes taxing more easy? So there's kind of is it a push, is it a pull kind of motivation for understanding how it comes to be that royal law can actually become more sophisticated, that I kind of found fascinating and not necessarily answered.
As a maybe a way to attack the question of why the Normans, Berman asked this question of why it is that the Pope would ally with the Normans, and why would the Normans ally with the Pope or the papacy, because the Normans in Italy didn't actually respect the primary point of stopping lay investiture, which was a primary point of the papal revolution. So, okay, let me say quickly, there's this weird thing about the Normans. They see themselves as holy warriors and dedicated to Christianity, and they like to rape and pillage. Right? So it's like they have like immense pride in themselves, but also see themselves as holy warriors, and somehow these things go together. And Berman says that the Pope needed their military might, right? So we know that after they're established themselves as successful in Italy, the Pope allies with them. And the second thing is, kind of a papal state needed other powers to recognize it as a legitimate power, to start that kind of focal spiral that I was mentioning earlier of kind of rulers being identified as rulers by other rulers. But the price paid by the Pope is the sack of Rome, when the Normans come in and burn Rome and cause, I guess.
And the flip is also true, right, Andrew? They're going to England and they need legitimacy. They're going to Sicily, they need legitimacy. Everybody needs legitimacy. So we're like, there's a nice give and take here.
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, right. So that's what he says next. Why would they? Because the paradox for the Normans is that they're kind of absolutists. So but yeah, in the first point he says it helped, the Pope helps legitimize their authority as being something more than mere power, something more than might. And the second point was that they have this shared mission to push out the Saracens and the Greeks, and to like have this kind of Christian mission. So they kind of share those things. And it says that the price for the Normans for this was, I don't remember. Do you guys remember? What does it say here? Yeah, they had to deal with the tensions of the Roman Church with their desire to dominate the clergy. They had to like put up with at least talk of limits to their power. And I don't know.
I guess
that part was less clear to me.
one thing that I thought from what you said, Jacob, is when we're asking this question, why the Normans, right? If the Norman invasion of England happened, but not Sicily, we wouldn't be asking why the Normans, or vice versa. If Sicily happened and they didn't invade England, we wouldn't be asking why the Normans. We'd be like, yeah, this happens occasionally. People conquest other people, right? But the fact that it's both of them at the same time, it might somewhat make sense. If I don't know if this is a legitimate mechanism or not, or if it actually makes sense historically. But the fact that if legitimacy is needed to get these kingdoms off the ground, right, then the papacy, it's much easier for the papacy to make a deal with the Normans and legitimize these new growing Norman groups than it is to legitimize it just so happened that the two groups that the papacy decided to make a legitimacy deal with were both Norman, right? It might have been lower transaction costs for the Pope to make such sorts of legitimacy deals. That explains why it's the same I don't know, it's not ethnic group, might not be the right word, but the same culture, right?
Yeah, it's one contract, not two. Yeah.
Yeah, so a very, very basic Kosian story.
Mm-hmm. But
And it's
thinking,
one, sorry, it's one contract, not two, and then it's also the point that was made earlier. They're also not only in England, but in Sicily and in southern Italy, they're very close to the Pope. And so there's more pressure with the Pope to bargain with the Normans as opposed to like the random like barbarians in like Northern Europe, right? So there's also like that pressure there of having that military might in the Pope's backyard.
mm-hmm.
And also just before we don't run out of time to I want to mention that he doesn't really, this is maybe where I think one of the blind spots of the book is, that maybe Caleb and I will want to pick up on in the future, is he doesn't really mention the fact that the schism with the East happens right before all of these events occur. And then also he doesn't really mention the Crusades that much. He mentions them offhand every once in a while. Like when he's talking about Frederick Barbarossa later, he's like, oh, by the way, he died in one of the Crusades or something. So like, and this whole movement, and kings are the people raising armies for the Crusades, and the papacy is making these deals with kings and legitimizing them right at the time where they happen to want to rise an army to go out in the Crusades. So I think there must be something related there, and the Crusades are something happening sort of as a B plot to the European plot for like the next few hundred years. Right, and it's a fascinating story, but it's happening over the course of the next 100 years, and all of this development of canon law and everything is happening. All of Berman's story is happening sort of parallel to the Crusades story, and he doesn't really engage with that too much, and especially the Sicilian Normans, who are some of like the first really successful crusaders.
Nice.
Let's just point out before moving on that Berman says that one of the different constraints that the English Normans faced compared to the Italian is that there were higher, they had to deal with greater support for the papacy in England. There was more support for the papal party. And then, of course, as we explored previously, the anarchy of Stephen and both the anarchy of Stephen and the growth of the church power and the execution of Thomas Becket created like particular political issues that kind of made things more strongly separate, some stronger separation between the spiritual and secular.
Or the murder of Thomas Becket. It wasn't a formal execution.
It wasn't an execution. It was, I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I will roll into my
ahead.
section. So just like high level thing. So first of all, it's 445 through 481. As Andrew said, I think off camera, there's a lot of details in this section, but I'm going to sort of tell you the high level story. The two main characters are Henry II in England, and then Philip Augustus, who's Philip II, I think, in France. And there's some stuff about Normandy as well. The sort of main story is sort of picking up on this, like, royal law is being rationalized and developed in England, and in France to a lesser extent, sort of lagging behind. Henry II is a very strong king relative to, I guess, his uncle, or Stephen, and also some of his predecessors, and definitely his sons. And he starts sort of a project of like working out like royal law in England, as opposed to baronial law or ecclesiastical law, or like the merchant law. So in some sense, he's sort of like stepping into the legal fray. And it starts with sort of itinerant justices in Ire sort of going around and not only just taking royal law like to the outskirts, but also sort of learning about like what's going on and how legal practices are out in the periphery. So to a very real extent, like royal law is what we think of as common law. And that dynamic is sort of has that spiral nature. It's common because it's royal. It's royal law covers all, and so it's common to all. But the itinerant nature of the justices, and sort of the way that royal law works, sort of encourages learning from the periphery. And so it thus becomes the rules that are common amongst the realm become royal law. This is also, I mean, not exactly the same, but there's an increased rationalization and development in France as well. France is much more fragmented. There's no like real thing as France at this time. There's the Ile-de-France, which is sort of the royal domain. The royal domain works slightly differently than in England. In France, the royal domain is basically the extent of the king's writ. So you can think of it that outside the royal domain, the king really has less power and authority. So that sort of story, everything else, sort of again brings up this question. And I haven't been here for the whole ride with you guys, but like, what's going on in the 11th and 12th century that is leading to increased rationalization and development of law, but also like the size and authority of the king in and of itself. Like, he is growing in authority in England and in France. So that's sort of my main question. Any thoughts? Did I miss anything? Oh, I should say, like, the reading itself has just like all this procedural and extra great richness to it that I sort of glossed over in saying it's becoming rationalized and developed. So
to add to your story, the part was that was in my reading that kind of right before yours is there had been itinerant justices before, but the thing about the justices in Eyre is that they were a regular journey in
right, and
professionalized. Regular, professionalized. Just it had a pattern of continuation, and Berman argues that the thing that made Stephen particularly weak in the case of the tensions that led to the anarchy was that not only Stephen but his predecessors, in order to maintain rule, they had to keep moving. They were kind of on the road all the time, and Henry II kind of sees a need to have an administrative structure that can operate without his having to be in any particular place. And so the justices in Eyre is a part of it, establishing that. But also he establishes the high court, which becomes the court of common pleas and a permanent place, a regular open permanent court in Westminster. He maintains the King's Court, which moves with him, but that later becomes an established place, and the jurisdiction of these courts gets worked out. And then he establishes a chancery in imitation of the Pope. I don't know how much of this is parallel because of the movement of ideas and how much of this is direct imitation of the Pope. That's not clear to me, but just like the Pope's seal, the chancery is the bearer of the King's seal and is able to do things in the King's name, in kind of non-military matters. And this again becomes a professionalized administration, the chancery and the chancellor is the kind of overarching government administration that makes all the pieces coordinate to the King's, the advantage of coordination and the King's purpose. Otherwise,
and it moves with him.
What's that?
It moves with him too.
Yeah. Yeah, he says initially the justiciar was the person who ruled in the King's absence. For example, Richard the Lionheart was able to leave the realm, and the government kept going because of what Henry II had established. But later, the chancellor became the party who ruled in the King's absence.
That question, that practical question of whether or not then for the king to establish a chancellor is very similar to Gary Miller's book, Managerial Dilemmas, which John Nye covers in his class. And it's the basic idea of, it's basically a lot of institutional transaction costs kind of economics. Oliver Williamson, right? And the larger the firm gets, the harder it is for the guy at the top to know what's going on the ground floor, right? The harder it is for him to not only monitor workers to prevent them from shirking, but to monitor workers in order to coordinate their actions, right? But then the trade-off is that when you delegate, you lose a little bit of control, right? So you can delegate, and then you can make someone make choices closer to the ground floor, but they're a little bit out of your control. So what makes it possible for there to be a law that might actually allow the king to also check his chancellor at the same time? That's a little bit of a managerial dilemma for the common law, right? Whether or not to extend,
the judiciary is eventually abandoned, from what I understand, because of that problem. Like, he's getting a little too powerful.
When was that? When was that?
I think relatively early. Did Henry? I guess Henry.
Yeah, I think it would have to be
That's a
after
good
Richard.
question.
I think it'd have to be after Richard
Yeah.
Lionheart, based on who succeeded Henry II.
Yeah.
Based on what Berman says.
It must be John, or maybe John had it for earlier and then he abandoned him. I'm not sure, but I know the French king also had a justiciar. That's a word I can't say, and he abandoned him with the position, I should say.
That is also this. I'm really enjoying this. I don't know where to go with it, because maybe you guys know that literature better than I. But something that's really maybe relevant to modern issues is the deep state. What we're saying is, you know, what's really great is we got away from absolutism of one king arbitrarily telling people what, not arbitrarily, he's by law. Okay, but what is it that enabled there to be an administrative structure that further limited the king? Well, it was the establishment of the chancery, or we could say the seeds of the deep state. You know, it's like
The bureaucracy.
And the bureaucracy is the government, separate from the person of the king. But then the danger is that bureaucracy can have incentives of its own that don't necessarily align with, you know, certain long-term interests of the community as a whole.
So the way to go with that would be, there's lots of different branches of the bureaucracy. There's the chancery, there's, you know, the exchequer, which sits in Westminster, there's the household wardrobe, and what's the other one? We'll just go with that. So throughout the Middle Ages, the household wardrobe and the chancery fight with each other, and they wane and wax over time. Like, eventually the chancery sits at home and the wardrobe ascends to its prominence in government. So there's like this inter-bureaucracy fighting that is checking they're checking each other. And I think the king uses that to like navigate around the bureaucracy and kind of do what he wants. So he gets a little bit of the benefit of bureaucracy, but he's also able to use its structure to bend the rules when he wants to.
Is maybe Jacob, you know the history of this, and you can shed light on it. So the danger in America today is that there's too much administrative law, there's too much administrative delegation from the legislator, such that there's lots of rules being made that aren't being constrained by either how many people there are who can look at it, who are representatives of the people. You know, it has kind of a life of its own. We're getting too much regulation, and not necessarily regulation that people would want. It seems analogous if the legislator is the king. If the king is the legislator and needs this bureaucracy to do stuff, but not too much of it, it seems like the people's willingness to allow this administrative law to take over has similar. It's like you get a lot of done quickly, but then it's like, uh-oh, you know, no one's checking what's going on anymore. What can you say? Where that led the king? Like, I mean, eventually the king became nothing. Eventually, effectively nothing. So, will the people become nothing in a democratic republic unless you scale back administrative bureaucracy?
That's a good question. I'm editorializing a little bit, but my sense is that the Middle Ages are actually quite democratic. I editorialize that word, in that like the barons can check him. So he can't just do whatever he wants because he's gonna lose. He's gonna lose the vote and find his head on like a stake. And it's not really until we get to the early modern period, we think of like Henry VIII, Elizabeth, that we get these authoritarians in England, I should say. And there's a sort of decline in democracy, like where we get this like large administrative state. And besides the bureaucracy and the size of the state in the 16th century just balloons in size. Yeah, so that's my initial reaction. But that's a great question. That's a great question. I think like the question of why develop this bureaucracy is sort of this perennial question. There's a lot of people have worked on this. Like we say these, like it's really great to have the rule of law and some structure to the royal government or the dictator's government for growth, but if that's going to hamper me, why am I ever going to do it? Right. So there is like a in the king's eyes, what's the optimal amount of bureaucracy to have? And something is happening in this era that is multifaceted, right? It's the papal revolution. There's something like the king's authority is growing vis-a-vis the barons, it seems, on the margin, where he's sort of able to like exert some more authority. Yeah. Because it's just one thing, like on the itinerary, I have the itineraries and I'm working on that. What I can, and just my knowledge, any really solid, like primary source stuff is going to come like after Henry. And everything before that is a bit more unclear. Like we're talking, like there's no primary source document from the state, like really prior to Henry. So besides the bureaucracy is ballooning at this time.
Both in Sicily and in England, the first people to come in are brutal military geniuses.
Mm-hmm.
And then Roger II in Sicily, and I guess Henry II, they probably fall both under this description of Roger II, which is Roger craved power and glory, but preferred to gain and maintain them less by war than by diplomacy and intrigue. And law was a key to power and glory, and a peaceful means to control the polyglot kingdom. So it's like, it just seems like war is, there's got to be something that's costly about war, that once a certain position is established, law has to be a cheaper or more desirable way of maintaining and extending power rather than fighting. Perhaps that's one thing.
And to
maintaining power. It's like there's the move from taking power and then maintaining power.
To contrast and talk about what's in the second part of the chapter on contrasting France and England, it seems, and this was my takeaway from it, the way that he contrasts France and England is something like France is a little bit, the French king is actually a little bit less powerful, such that he has to delegate to all of these local duchies or counts, whatever to rule whatever their own territory is, and then to be the adjudicator or the primary judge for that area. And then the Parlement of Paris is just where things get kicked up to if necessary, right? Whereas in England, the king is itinerant, is much more itinerant than in France, even though I believe the French king was itinerant to a significant degree, right? But in Britain, you actually have more of a common law than you had in France. So we think of the French king as more dictatorial in the long run, right? In some ways, but the French law was more internally incoherent, whereas English law was much more common, literally, right? And then that continues on all the way into the early modern era when you look at stuff like the internal regulations and tariffs in France versus external lower tariffs. And then in England, you have tariffs at the borders of England, but very few within England, right? Something like that. That's like off the work of John Knott.
Andrew, just a quick question on the page. Do you remember the page where he's talking about the king's court? Do you have that? Like,
Yes, that would be. That is on page 444.
nice.
And
Cool.
another thing that Berman says is happening is that because of the split between this, we said it right at the very beginning, but because of the split between the spiritual and the secular, there's something in the philosophy of the papal revolution, and I can't quite articulate why this is so. I've forgotten from the rest of the book, but the secular is seen as the realm. The role of secular law is to establish peace and justice. It kind of comes to be seen as the role, and that's identified with the king. So the king, in order to justify his role, he's no longer a sacral, he's no longer the vicar of Christ. He's no longer a sacred entity in religious sense. And he's not a chieftain. He's a territorial guy with power. And his authority comes from his role as extender of the religious purpose of establishing peace and justice on earth. So that's another thing that's going on, not just like external economic, political power factors, but it is a political power factor that if other people think that is your role, that is what spiritually authorizes you to have power, you've got to respect that. And then also the king is in the culture that says that's you get up in the morning, you're like, why am I even here? Am I just here to rape and pillage? Oh no, I have a spiritual purpose, and that is, and Berman's, I again don't have the phrase, but Berman says there was something that appeared in the Scandinavian law for the first time, or it said that law came to be seen as the very essence of peace. This is on 521. Law was seen as the way of fulfilling the mission of Western Christendom, and to begin to achieve the kingdom of God on earth. I don't know where this quote was, but there was one of the first law books after the Papal Revolution said something to the effect of that law is. Oh yeah, here it is. It's in the Sachenspiegel.
Saxon. It's like Saxon, I think.
Saxon Spiegel. No, that's not it. It is there. He says God is himself law, and therefore law is dear to him. But yeah, he says something to the effect that the most sacred purpose outside the church is to maintain law and justice. That is what law is. Like, law is God's purpose on earth outside the church. So, and
I think that framing, it answers or it comes close to addressing what Caleb was asking earlier when he was asking basically the big question of the book, but particularly framed to royal law. And so in the introduction, Berman lists all of these various unique qualities of the Western legal system, that it's objective, that it's rational, and then one of those things in that list is that it's able to grow. Right. And towards the end of the book, and especially by the conclusion, he ends up talking like all of those other things: objectivity, rationality, coherence. Those are actually kind of preconditions to the real crown of it, which is that it's able to grow. And one of the preconditions is for it to be able to grow is that it has a purpose, right? That it grows in a direction, that it's a body that grows more towards its purpose. So it's those qualities, and the fact that this law is reflecting something that's going on in the church is what gives it a unique characteristic that other legal systems don't have. So for example, in whatever the Roman, pagan Roman imperial law, the law is the series, the judgments of the various courts, but also the just the dictates of the emperor, which is a body of law that you have that same dynamic of rule by law and then rule of law in the Roman Empire. But here, since the law the overall is in this cloud of the purpose of the Christian church and ultimate some form of inexpressible justice and peace on earth as it is in heaven, something like that, then it takes on this additional character that it's able to grow and answer questions in the future that I don't even know I have yet, right? Because you act first with the faith that there is there is a possibility of justice that God is offering to us if we conduct ourselves the right way. And it's only with that precondition and the law to be framed in those terms that the law can be set up such that it can grow and respond to new situations. So adapt and grow, kind of like all the stuff that's in the earlier chapters, like that it's like the cathedrals are growing up higher and closer to the heavens, right? And I think that that's somewhat of what Caleb's question was. That's why royal law occurred at this time. It was only able to occur because of the church and church offering this form of law, right? And that it was rational enough that it was copyable into the secular domain, right? And that's, I guess, what's unique about the revolution. The Eastern Church has that mission, same sort of mission, but it doesn't have the rational coherence supposedly that allows it to be copied, right? That's, I think, a big part of his argument. And then that growth is what makes it practically so attractive and selected for evolutionarily somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess on that we can move on to Caleb's section.
Okay, yeah. This is one of the shorter sections, and it's on Germany, but then also like Spain, Flanders, Hungary, and a bunch of other countries. But the solid chunk of the majority of this section is on Germany, which he contrasts with Sicily and with England, where Sicily and England, the royal law was quite strong and developed, and took hold, whereas in Germany you can't really describe there being a king like there was in the way in England or in Sicily, because there are these like 5 major duchies, and so Germany is more working as like this imperial federation, and so the emperor is trying to hold everything together, but is kind of like lacking the power to actually assert authority, to get the law to be promulgated and carried out throughout the land. And so he highlights that even though you can't say that royal law developed a sophistication and a universality maybe that you get in England or in Sicily, you still do see this expansion of the idea of royal law. You see things being copied after the Roman law, and Roman being used in the title of this German Empire, and so there is that copying going on, and the response and expansion of royal law is happening as a downstream effect of the papal revolution. So the timing still works out with that, with Berman's story, but he does recognize that the emperor, his religious authority is greatly reduced by the investiture controversy, and the princes, so the duchies and the smaller principalities within Germany kind of help mediate that. It's important that the emperor had no power, at least prior to the papal revolution, had no power to tax outside of the jurisdiction that he had. So the emperor had a particular duchy or principality that he had direct control over, and then he was also the emperor of this federation of duchies, but he didn't have the ability to tax outside of his particular duchy or principality, the imperial states. So the German emperor here is quite weak compared to the other places that Berman had highlighted in the previous chapters. An important figure who plays a role in this chapter is Frederick Barbarossa, who's kind of the most effectual at expanding this legal authority of the German emperor. And it seems like throughout these chapters, Berman's identifying these pivotal figures who kind of take control in a way that they can start reforming and creating this royal law. There's a development of German diets that are kind of similar to parliaments, but they have a lot less power than the the emperor had a lot less power over the diets compared to the English king over parliament. So again, we're seeing this weakness of this German king or emperor, and they're not supposed to represent the empire as a whole. And there's this beginning of the issuance of secular peace statutes. So this separation of the ecclesiastical and the secular taking place first in 1103, but then it's not until the mid 12th century that you see Barbarossa really expanding these peace statutes and seeing a good amount of change, where where instead of needing the people under him to swear oaths, he is able to promulgate it as this new issuance of law that they're expected to follow. So it's not on this base of consent from the people who are being governed. Berman also emphasizes the nature of how the law, even as it's being codified, it's codifying and working with local customary law. So that's why you're starting to see some distinctions and differences in in royal law across places, is because they are systematizing law and imitating canon law, but they're also working within and adapting more customary local laws. And so the royal laws are kind of this strange mixture between royal law, between these local customary laws and the canon law that's being developed at the time. It's also kind of important to highlight, so within these principalities, you see the legislative power of principalities expand significantly after the Papal Revolution. So there's at least a recognition by Berman that maybe it's more important to look at royal law as taking place within the principalities of the German Empire as opposed to at the imperial level. And then he also notes that the judicial system was expensive and required this expansion of taxation, and there's this separation between the idea of criminal law and tort law within royal laws within the principalities. And then that's most of what he's talking about for Germany, and then he goes through the other locations, and with all the other locations that he talks about, they get maybe a page or two. They're not really expanded upon that much. He doesn't really hit on them that hard, but most of what he's doing by recognizing things like Spain or Hungary is showing that this arising of royal law is not something that is particularized to England or to Sicily, but this is a Western phenomena, that this is happening in Western Europe as a whole. And so that's kind of the main thrust of what he's saying about Spain or Flanders, is that this is kind of a more global, or something that's encompassing Western Europe as a whole, not just these particular places. But that's the main purpose that they function in his story. It's not really a case study in anything more than just showing that it's happening there. And then towards the end of the chapter, he goes through some points on commonalities that are running across royal law and canon law, and he has 5, and so they're both royal law and canon law exercise limited competence and limited jurisdiction. They're both grounded in authority from external sources of law. Third is that they were systematized and were seen as being rationalized. Fourth is the people were conscious of the fact that they are systematizing and growing, that the law is supposed to grow over generations. So they're not operating under the idea that they're creating royal law, systematizing it, but then they have a final system. There's an awareness that the law needs to adapt and change. So they're no longer operating within the mindset of like a reformed customary law, but instead seeing them creating some kind of new type of law. And then both laws are moving towards a purpose, and that purpose is really justice. And so these are the 5 things that he's identifying as being common across royal law and canon law. And so that's kind of the main thrust of this chapter. And I think it's still interesting to see, and maybe Germany kind of poses this interesting puzzle of, okay, we have England and we have Sicily, and they're able to pull off this kind of revolutionary change into this development of royal law, and it works, and they have this strong authority that allows them to pull it off and make this transformation. And Germany kind of offers us this different perspective where Barbarossa is trying to pull off this creation of royal law across Germany, and it doesn't really work. It does, they do expand, they pull something off. It's not nothing, but it's definitely pales in comparison to Sicily or to what happens in England. And so it's interesting to think about maybe what leads to this failure on the part of Germany, and then some of the other places that he talks about. And maybe it has something to do with the power that was there that pre-existed, because the German imperial state wasn't really able to tax outside of its own imperium, and so that might lead us to some kind of conclusion about why the royal law gets less established in Germany. I think it's also interesting to note how little attention Spain gets, and maybe it's just because of the time period that he's operating in, but at least within economic history, you have the idea of this great divergence between Europe and the rest of the world, but then there's also the little divergence where the real economic powerhouses of the earlier parts of Europe are in southern Italy, or southern Europe, where you have Italy, Spain, and Portugal being the powerhouses, and then that shifts up and becomes like England, Northern Germany, and the Netherlands become the economic powerhouses, and that's this shift that happens over time. And so I thought it was kind of interesting that England gets this attention as this special place where law transformations are happening, but Spain, which is a powerhouse from 1200 to 1500, and maybe even beyond that a little bit. So they're this economic powerhouse for a while, and they kind of get like a page or two in his analysis. And so maybe this is an interesting topic to tease out, as well as why Spain gets so little attention in the story.
I think it's just hard to talk about Spain as a unit, even more so than Holy Roman Empire, right? Because it's multiple duchies and multiple religions, so it's hard to track much. I mean, it's the religion isn't really properly homogenized until the Inquisition, right? I guess afterwards would.
That's fair, but the Reconquista, that it gets, I mean, that doesn't get finished until 1492 when they take Granada, but Granada was this last little stronghold that held out, and most of Spain was recaptured far earlier. And I guess it's fair that at the time of the Papal Revolution, you have Spain is not Christianized and unified in the way that it became later, but it is still kind of fascinating that even throughout its history and its development and its consolidation, you don't see this kind of important development of royal law in the way that you see it happening in England or in Sicily. Which points us back to something special about the Normans.
Yeah, there's some in thinking about the time period, it's like the Papal Revolution plus something about like royal authority vis-a-vis the other elites. Maybe that sort of explains Germany as well, sort of spatial stuff as well. But what exactly that is, like the relationship that changes, I don't know. It's a good question.
One thing that I noticed from this chapter was when I remember this one from when you taught econ history, Jacob, when we talk about the fragmentation of states in Europe relative to other parts of the world. Obviously, it evokes for economists, political scientists, the idea of Tibu competition, right? That if you can move to another location quite easily, then that's an incentive for the authority, whatever, to provide incentives for you to stay, like voting with your feet, right? And so when you look at the map of medieval Europe, you're like, wow, there's got to be a ton of Tibu competition going on in the Holy Roman Empire, right? Like there's like every 5 feet you're in another, kingdom or whatever, another duchy, right? But you get the sense from this chapter that that's not the case, and it was actually more difficult in somewhere like the Holy Roman Empire to have these competing legal systems than in England, right? Because in England you have the common law, right? So you get the best of both worlds in England, because you have legal competition between the royal law and the ecclesial law, but you also have the commonness of the common law, right? Such that it's easier to trade within England and you have less interjurisdictional barriers and stuff like that, right? And just the basic transaction costs fact that it is hard to move, it is difficult to move. Whereas I would wonder if, there's some kind of spatial paper here somewhere, right? Which is somehow like tracking sources of ecclesiastical law in England, and to those places, does the king go there or not go there, or whatever, something like that, something with your data, somebody could do something, or we could do something, we could figure it out.
Yeah, I just didn't really know a lot about Germany and Spain and the other countries, so it was cool to see that.
And the other point is no independent cities, right? In addition to the competition with the canon law, in Germany, the cities are part of the duchy. They're just sort of like administered things that the Duke is like, it would be quite good if we had a city here, no? And they'll like administer it or whatever. Whereas in England, the cities are their own independent bodies, and actually they're sponsored by the king, but eventually they become their own force as well. And that's Smith's story, right? Smith's story of interjurisdictional competition doesn't have too much of the church involved. It's mostly between the towns and the lords, right? But I guess Berman's fuller story would be it's the church, the towns, and the king all competing with one another somehow creates the great system you have in England.
Yeah, Barry Weingast has a paper that is like that.
Do you know what it's called?
Something about like the decline of feudalism or the church or something. I don't know.
Okay, I'll look it up.
Do we know where elites live in Germany, Spain, and what were the other ones? I guess Flanders, it's urban. Do we like, there's like this, like in England and in France, they all live in the countryside. But I think in Italy, they live in the urban areas. Something about coordination costs of revolt, living in the countryside is lower than living in the urban area. Sort of checking the king, checking royal law.
I don't think he addresses it in the chapter. I'm not familiar off the top of my head.
Yeah, like you said, Andrew, there's a lot of details.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get this section brought back this section, and I guess all of those little sections, they had little sprinkles of how the peace of God movement influenced those other places, which was quite interesting to see pop up as well. Which I know there have been some historical studies, and there is one recent paper in, I guess, what you call historical political economy, the sort of interdisciplinary field, on basically trying to predict the rise of towns and growth based on where there were these Cluniac monasteries. So that's a paper that I'm hoping to engage with over time. Which so I think they focus mostly on England, France, Germany, but they don't talk about like Spain, the influence of it in Spain and such like that. So yeah. The
I
school
don't
of
like that
Salamanca
paper.
comes up. Yeah, I
So we'll
need
talk
to dig
about it. I
into it
don't like
more.
that paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should talk about it. Yeah. So I can figure out what not to do, allegedly.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about this chapter? Things people want to bring up?
Not that we haven't said already. I mean, the rise in royal law is particularly interesting, you know, spurred on by the paper revolution. But then there's that other thing, like the constraint, like they're able to sort of overcome potential other authorities and kind of push them out of the market, as it were. So there's like these twofold thing. I guess like think about the learning mechanism that I think Andrew brought up earlier. The clergy are the guys who are going to be staff in this bureaucracy, right? They're the guys who can read and write, and so they're sort of bringing their training to the development of royal law.
Yeah, I
So
guess
that'd be one learning mechanism.
it's oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, I guess since we're approaching the end, before we talk about the conclusion, we can talk about other reflection things on the whole book. I guess the second chapter, which is on the theology, right? I thought that there was a little bit of a that chapter to me is the most kind of ad hoc in a way, because he's just sort of saying like, look at all of these elements of Western theology which are so legal, right? They're talking about God has to punish man for sins, and so the contract has to be fulfilled, sort of thinking in those terms, and then that somehow gets imported into the Western legal system. And so it's relating to what you said, Jacob, because it's the priests bringing in their training. How much of it is just the fact that canon law is more rational? How much of it is this Anselm's soteriology? How much is that actually what is framing this whole issue? It's not clear. And then just the idea that Andrew mentioned earlier, that God is law, that comes from some of these chapters, these later chapters, right? It's the cloud of the canon law is clearly somehow influencing all of this. That's his major claim. But the exact mechanism is always hard. Is it because of the priests? Is it imitation? Is it all of these different things? His overall story, I'm very convinced by, but some of the particular mechanisms, I mean, there can be multiple mechanisms is the thing too. So,
Well, he
No.
at multiple points, he talks about people knowing that there's something about the need to compete that requires you to know what the other guys are doing. There's something about the need to fill in the gap. So if you're dedicated to the idea that law is a body, you need principles to fill the gaps. So the Roman law and the canon law are, you know, the people are kind of looking and learning from the competition between these different jurisdictions of law, both to compete against, adopt what's desirable, give something that's complementary, fill in the gaps. And so the people in universities are there's just like this legal consciousness, and people are aware of these bodies of law and they're learning about them as one of these mechanisms. But I've forgotten so much of the book. It's tragic. It's a lot of pages. It's a lot of pages, and I was trying to just look back and thinking, oh yeah, I don't remember all the details. I'm not sure I get even the most important parts. So
yeah, I mean, it's such a like a massive volume and undertaking. It's really like a I'm not going to go ahead and compare it to the Wealth of Nations, but I mean, it's something it's something like that. I don't think I would go there, but it's a similar kind of thing where you can keep revisiting it and going to the key chapters, right? It's even got maybe more of a coherent overtone than the Wealth of Nations, more explicit at least, but yeah.
Yeah, related to what you were saying earlier, Andrew, Constitutions of Clarendon is a nice example. Like Henry II is dealing with the aftermath, or no, this is before Becket. He's sort of dealing with Becket, and Beckett has like stuff on the bargaining table. Like, this is what we have. Bam, 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 bam.
Mhm.
And Henry looks around and goes, oh, what do we have? Oh, maybe we should write it down. Like, okay, here's our argument. Bam, 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 bam. And that, like, just crystallizing, like, this is our argument, or this is the domain of the state vis-a-vis the church, is an important step. So it's like part of the bargaining, like part of going to the bargaining table forces you to think about, what are our chips?
I guess we could move on to the conclusion and then work it out from there.
How much longer do we
then-
have? Are we thinking another 12 minutes?
I could go longer than that because I'm going to say a little bit and then we could say what we all maybe even include final thoughts about the whole book if we have any criticism or something like that. But anyway, I'll just quickly try to say what I get out of the conclusion, which I thought was really cool and I thought was a really good thing, not just to talk about the ideas in this book, but also the way that you engage with social science as a whole. And he's saying something that you wish other people were able to say, but people still get trapped in these little boxes, right? So the first 10-15 pages of the conclusion is kind of a really nice just summary of the book, summary of his overall argument, right? And so if you, and summary of all the different secular law chapters, he's got a couple paragraphs covering each one of them. So if you are just watching this video because you're trying to skip doing reading for school or something like that, just go to the first 10-15 pages of the conclusion and you get basically a summary of the book. But
Which
the
one is end of the 4th episode.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
So you-
yeah. Yeah, that's all you needed this whole time. But the second half of the conclusion has a subtitle called Beyond Marx, Beyond Weber, right? Which is, he has already given us a hint of at the end of the section on urban law when he discussed the same sort of idea and then gave a little bit of his conclusion. I don't know why it's sort of stuck in there, but it shows up here at the conclusion where it seems to be a little bit more fitting, right? And so he compares the way that Marxists approach the theory of law, which is Marxists have sort of this material dogma where the only thing that matters fundamentally is some sort of economic purpose, economic interest, economic reason behind something that exists. And on its face, law or ideas like are hard to match with this Marxist dogma in a sense. And so Marx ends up having like, well, there's property rights, like you would go into a court of law and they'd adjudicate property rights. And then there's property rights, which is, hey, the capitalist owns everything, right? And the capitalist actually has the control over stuff. That's what real property rights is versus the ideological sort of wishy-washy version of property rights, which he accuses the bourgeois economists of dealing in terms of. So that's why bourgeois economists are criticized as being ideological, because they're only dealing with this abstract version of property rights, not the on the ground, real hard version of property rights. But basically beyond the various particular historical issues with Marx's account of history, Berman basically says that he can never fully understand what law actually is or how it functions, right? Because that's just not the way that people are. And every time that Marx ends up talking about law, he has to talk about it performing some sort of function, and then he'll cut it in half into the part that he thinks is the material part and the part that he thinks is the ideal part. But then he's actually cutting in half what law is. So his dogma that everything is material doesn't really hold up. And so moving on in German social thinkers in the 19th century, you get someone like Weber, who, on the other hand, you might think of as he's the one that is interested in people's ideas and overbeliefs and philosophies and how those influence their behavior, as opposed to the Marxist dogma of economics only. Weber is not as dogmatically on the other side, right? But he's associated as the one that has theories about the Protestant Reformation leads to the rise of capitalism, or some ideological change is what leads to the rise of something else. A little bit in the spirit of McCloskey, but a little bit out of step with McCloskey, which I think maybe we can get into a little bit. But what Weber's sort of theoretical tool ends up being is this thing called the ideal type, which is where we take an example of, let's say, well, I'm thinking about it in terms of the Yanikoni idea of church and sect, that actually has some of its origins in Weber. So they'll say, well, there's one type of organization called a church, and it's a large body of people that are acting according to some various ritual, and then there might be a sect, which is a smaller group of people that are very highly committed to a specific type of idea, right? And so Weber will theoretically generate all of these ideal types, which none of them exist exactly in person, but that's what he thinks in terms of, is ideas motivating these various organizations of society. So ideas are primarily what's driving things moving forward. But Berman basically says that these ideal types, they never perfectly capture any particular thing. So every time you propose some sort of ideal type as a theory, and every example of it that you find in history confirms that your ideal type was a good theory, but everything that's a little bit lockstep out of it, where you say, oh, that's an exception, right? And so it's really like a non-falsifiable, it's ultimately not a very satisfactory way of saying, well, I theorized history properly, right? But what Berman sort of offers is some sort of middle way, or sort of proposes what his idea of history was as a middle way, and that law, and particularly the Western legal tradition, sort of shows that this dichotomy of Weber or Marx, or material or ideal motivations or explanations of historical phenomena is really not possible, because Western law was something that was both material and practical as well as ideological at the same time. And it being both of those things is what made it work. And that's, in a sense, the argument of his whole book. One way that you can think about it is that what we can do, and he kind of says this, and I think I'm paraphrasing him, but apparently I'm quoting him from page 554. So we can think of something like the economic material interests. Those are going to tell us that there is a need for a legal order in order for trade to get off the ground, but it's not able to tell us particularly what the character of that legal order is. There are many, let's say some legal order, we can have some economic theory that says some legal order which meets conditions A, B, and C is necessary for this society to, at a basic level, function. But our theory is not going to say whether that legal system also comes along with characteristics D, E, F, or X, Y, Z, right? It can be any mixture of those other ones. Economics just sort of presents what the practical question is for this society, but it doesn't actually tell us how people are going to go about answering it, which is going to vary, and that's going to be maybe where more of the ideological stuff comes in. So, and he says law is the best place to look for this, and particularly the Western legal tradition. And I'll just quote what he says about law on page 557. He says, law is not only fact, it is also idea or concept, and in addition, it is a measure of value. Unlike purely intellectual and moral standards, law is required to be practiced, but unlike purely material conditions, it consists of ideas and values, right? So if something like Weber's idea of the Protestant work ethic, that's kind of an intellectual and moral standard. The difference between that and a law is that if the law is not followed, if it's actually not part of the practice of a society, it's not the law, right? The law is always characterizing something that they actually do. It's a de facto law. I guess there's a law in the books, but then there's the de facto law. But then also law is made out of ideas, and it's made out of concepts, right? It doesn't correspond to anything hard and a physical constraint. It's words, us talking to one another, right? And then he says later on, the fact that law is, in its very nature, both material and ideological, is connected with the fact that law both grows upward out of the structures and customs of the whole society and moves downward from the policies and values of the rulers of society, right? And then on the last page, he has this quote from Octavio Paz, is the last line of the book. He says, every time a society finds itself in crisis, it instinctively turns its eyes towards its origins and looks there for a sign. So that's relating to some of the things that I'm curious and working on in looking at what the sort of Lachmanian theory of institutions is, which is this idea that there's always these coordination and practical issues that we're dealing with, but you have to refer to the ideas, the subjective, sort of the more intellectual roots of a society in order to answer exactly how they're going to respond to these situations, particularly crisis situations where you can't just lean on whatever the legal order is. You have to refer to what Berman calls a legal system, the way that the legal order works together and the purpose that it gives itself. So I think that you can say something like economics provides, lets us best characterize what the practical questions that people needed to answer on the ground were, whereas the ideological and the investigation of of people's minds in the past, helps us understand better how they answered those questions. But Berman is saying we can't just do either one of those two things without the other, because one is providing questions, the other is providing answers. So the process of inquiry and the sort of dialogical, diachronic process of history is actually what you need to study. So he says at the beginning of the conclusion, I had to tell the whole story of Western law. Hitherto forth, people have only talked about the history of France or the history of the development of law in England or something like that. But if you don't understand the history of the Western legal system, you don't properly understand why the English were answering the questions that they were answering the way that they were, right? And that the Western legal system is actually what answers kind of his question in the first chapter, which is what is the West? Well, it's the domain of the world that was covered and was informed by the Western legal system, right? Something like that. So yeah, I think that was a super cool way to end the book, and it's like the way that I would love to be able to do social science. And I think it's close to the reason that where McCloskey goes, and it made me think she might have made a mistake in saying that what she wants to say is explain the world through ideas. She maybe should have said something closer to Berman, where she wants to explain the world through narratives, and the narratives that people tell themselves, and history is the word that he uses, right? So and that would connect more with her stuff on pragmatism and persuasion and narratives that people tell themselves. So narrative explanations of history are the way to go. And I thought this was a great book, and I want to hear what you guys think.
I found your overview exceedingly helpful to me, making sense of. I was trying to tie the threads together at the end, and you really helped me do that. He mentions in the introduction at the very beginning that he thought that there was a crisis, and that this book is in part, he's like a dying man. He thinks that the Western legal tradition is like a fish flapping on the land, and that it's almost dead, if not dead already. But he says, like a dying man drowning, he looks back upon his life and the flashes before his eyes, perhaps to seek some salvation, some kind of way out of this dilemma of death. And he says that we need the social theory of history as opposed to analytical positivist, natural law, and historical. It integrates these three things. And on pages 44 and 45, he gives 4 tasks for it. The first is to escape overly simplified conceptions of law. That's Marx and Weber. That's what you're talking about. The second is to adopt a historiography that's appropriate to legal history rather than economic, philosophical, or other kinds of history. So I'm not sure I know the answer to how that task is being solved. The third task is to study the fate of law in periods of revolutionary change. And the fourth was to help solve the crisis by looking not only at the Western legal tradition, but non-Western legal traditions and systems to generate a common legal language for mankind. So this third and fourth one relates to what you were saying. It kind of helped me, where you have a well-working set of legal institutions in the Lachman sense, or focal points in in Schelling sense. There's no crisis because people navigate and coordinate by those flags, by those Schelling points. So when you have a crisis, it means those are incapable of integrating and coordinating action. So the way you said it was, people have to look back at their culture, at their values, at their XYZs. What are these things that are not crystallized Schelling points, or what does Lachman call them? Signposts for orientation.
Yeah. He calls them institutions, is what he calls them.
And that's usually how I think about institutions, but different people use that term differently, right? But where the signposts do not exist, and the signposts, I've been reading another book by Roscoe Pound called The Ideal Element in Law, and he says that people usually think about law as the body of precepts that have been adopted, or perhaps precepts and techniques. And he says actually law is the body of precepts, authoritative techniques, and authoritative ideals, because there's always gaps in the law, and you have to, when the gaps form, you have to look to procedures, and when those two things fall, you have to look to ideals to have a law rather than just will. So so I guess the question is, has he what is it, how do we look back, how do we find the sources of creative solution when it seems like not only the precepts, when the techniques and ideals seem to have decayed. You know, if we've just got precepts being granted from a national authority, how do we look at the Western legal tradition and non-Western legal systems to create a common legal language for mankind that integrates analytic positivism, natural law, and historical sources to solve the crisis? And is my question making sense?
Mhm. And you know, and this problem I also was realizing is why he focuses so much on the growth. And when he says growth, what he means is the ability to generate new focal points, right? For places that we've never been before, right? To be able to like naturally construct signposts as you move further and further into the wilderness. And the more people there are and the more people you interact with, the more wilderness there is in a way, right? So,
Well,
and I think
the technological change and that kind of stuff.
and that's actually what I was going to bring up is technological change, because sometimes, because these moments where we need a signpost, that's from some practical situation that we find ourselves in. Like, I think a good example is what will we teach our children, right? If we have a public school, people of different ideologies, different religions in the same public school, you need to figure out what are we going to teach the children, right? And then so sometimes those problems are solved with a technological solution, right? Oh, like it's actually somewhat efficient for us to split into private schools or something like that, right? So we sort of dodged a bullet there, right? Where we would have had to solve this practical situation, but we have this sort of economic steam outlet. And that's what the way that a lot of cultural people talk about liberalism that way, in that all of these supposed practical problems that come from not having a common conception of the good, you're going to find moments where you can just go to some other option. Capitalism provides options, the market provides alternatives. And so you don't need as many focal points in coordinating things according to legal system. But if you're going to have a legal system that is allowed to grow and that people trust in and people trust will serve justice, whether it's the way they conceive it or not, then you're going to need to have a spirit over the whole thing, which eventually will lose. I also should mention that Berman apparently was a specialist in Soviet law. That was his actual specialty. So he might be exceptionally pessimistic because he was most immersed in the least Christian, least Western legal system or something. I don't know if it's the least Western, to be honest, but least Christian legal system that had yet existed.
But so just to recap, and Jacob, I don't know if you watched any of the previous conversations, but one of the crises is when you're putting the posts, there's got to be a belief that the law is a body and that has an answer, even if it's an answer that has to grow out of what was there before, that's separate from the will of the competing parties. But one of the crisis now is that people think that the law is just someone's will that is winning. And so they're like, it's not that there's not a synthesis that's integrated and making sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And also that the law is not the same thing as the good, but it's necessary for the good. But like the law has its own character that is needed for the good, but it's not the instantiation of like anyone's vision of the good simply. But the problem is how do you, if you don't have the belief in that the law is a body, that it has this principles of organic growth, that it is just will, how do you get out of this? I mean, I guess you got to go back to this and convince people, hey, it's still the fish isn't dead. Let's do CPR. Let's do CPR, everyone, on the fish and put it back in the water. What do you think?
Right. Yeah. It's sort of like, it's sort of amazing that it was able to come out of the royal law, that is, the time period it did, is sort of making the distinction between like a procedural rule or a piece of legislation and like this constitutional level, if we want to use that frame, move. And so it's like any piece of legislation, any piece of law is like a tool to be wielded at the constitutional level as well, getting at exactly the problem that you're saying. So yeah, like I don't it's difficult to think of how it even came about, like the law. So without understanding how it came about, I don't know if we can revive the fish.
So one important attribute that I think, kind of looking back at the entire book and reflecting on like why this idea of law as this body has kind of like died and has kind of transformed into it's used by someone who has a will to try to exert power, is one of the things that's super critical in his story is that the Western legal tradition is one where there's a multiplicity of legal codes and tradition with overlapping spheres of jurisdiction. And so Western law isn't a single kind of law, but it's this multiplicity of interacting bodies of law. And so I think maybe why he ends it with talking about royal law is kind of the legal code that ate the other ones. So there are the Western world doesn't have manorial law or feudal law. That's died away. The Lex Mercatoria, it's
Integrated
kind
into
of,
common law in England.
yeah, but it kind of gets eaten in common law there. It's kind of still in existence by the International Chamber of Commerce, kind of functions, but it's really kind of faded in its role. And then I think the really important one is canon law and royal law were kind of equals battling in equally respected spheres and battled across different lines. And the canon law still exists in the Roman Catholic Church and exists in the Eastern Orthodox Church as well, but it doesn't have the same role that it was playing 800 years ago. So no one, when they sin or commit do something wrong, do they think about what's going to happen when they get brought to court by their pope or by the bishop, or what their priest is going to do to rule over them. And there's been this move where the religious has become kind of subsumed by the secular, and it's not always exactly clear how that's playing out. And there is potentially one way that this kind of Western legal mindset starts arising is if you have this rise in the importance of canon law again, is actually what I think is something that his story suggests. And that kind of sounds crazy to talk about like in a 21st century America, but if we get to a place where within liberal societies, religious pluralism gets to the point where what becomes focal for states to adjudicate does not encompass things that religious people want to be governed, you would see this rise in the importance of canon law, and that could start to work its way into having some kind of importance in the Western imagination, and the Western way of thinking about things. And having this multiplicity of legal codes would kind of reinvigorate this idea that the law is something beyond any one power or multiple powers competing for authority, but something more like a way of pursuing the good or preserving justice. And so it's kind of like a final thought on how maybe this gets reinvigorated and maybe how it's started to fall apart.
If I can give an alternative example that doesn't necessarily rely on the religion. I don't know. As you were speaking, I'm thinking, what's the dominant religion of today? Oh, it's called wokeness. And what would the church of wokeness be like? And what would it take to have like a pope of wokeness? And would that be good for liberalism or not? I don't know. I had to figure that out. But an alternative, like for me, I'm a classical liberal, kind of libertarian type, depending on how you use those terms or mean them. And I used to think, what we need to do is have like judicial activism for my policy desires. I was like, we really need that. And then I started learning something about law, and I thought, what, it turns out that's what everyone's wanting to do. And what that does is it cannibalizes the law. And then there's no such thing as law. There's just fighting over politics and preferences over politics. And then there's actually this domain called law that requires some system of philosophy that separates the law from the preferences of the judge or the preferences of who appoints the judge. And so then I'm thinking, oh, okay, we've got this thing called originalism or there's some ideal form of originalism that can't actually solve all the problems of constitutional law. But of all the possibilities, it's the thing that most respects the idea that there is something called the law that's separate from the policy prescriptions of a party or a preference. And it's pretty good. You know, it's not as bad as it could be, and it's not ideal, but it's pretty good. So for me, the benefits of having something called law has committed me to the idea that, okay, if I were a judge, that would be what I would try to rule by, even if it's not what I want, even if it's not what I want the results to be. And it's the philosophy that I would like people to understand and adopt until someone provides me a better idea of what is in fact the law. But the point is there, and a lot of people who hold this belief are kind of conservative, or, you know, the people on the left are more typically today of the opinion that everything is power, and that the courts should be used as they are already being used as a means of power of some over others, and that they should be used as a means of power in the opposite direction. And so it's again, because it's not a shared value system that the law is of value, it's seen by one side plus part of the other side as a tool of power. And unfortunately, those who see the law as having value tend to be aligned with one part of one of the, you know, parts of the spectrum of political. And it could be that, you know, young lawyers who would be conservative, who there's like, we are always trying to live by the law and not push our point of view, and the other guys are they're advancing because they're pushing theirs. Maybe they'll give up this idea of the value of law too. So it's how do we develop this respect for law above power, law above political preferences?
And I think that the idea is that in these various crisis moments, if they're not addressed properly, it makes the foundation more shaky as things go on, because then more things do get in the middle of law that were actually just whoever had the most votes, instead of actually some sort of consensus was arrived at. Like the way he talks at the beginning of the conclusion about how the Western legal system developed was a series of compromises that of course included power struggles, right? But it was because of the structure of who that power was between, and that it wasn't just force versus force. It was a series of compromises of who was going to rule over what. And then you end up with but that both of them had to refer in conversation to a similar overarching idea, right? And we mentioned this in one of the earlier videos, but then there are groups like, they're kind of a specter, because you don't get a good sense of how popular they actually are, but like Catholic integralists or something like that are recommending in some way that the state should respect the Pope. And I don't get the sense that the ideas that they, or you know, but like it's even like an as if that would happen. Like if you guys know Aaron Ross Powell, who was at Cato for a long time, I saw some people on Twitter talking about Catholic integralist Kevin Valier, who's a Orthodox classical liberal philosopher, has been writing against them. So he was writing some things on Twitter against them, and then Aaron Ross Powell was like, yeah, I think here's a great argument against integralism. Most people aren't Catholic, so it's not going to work, you know. So but I don't even think that the vision that they have is per se what even Berman is talking about was the condition of the society at the time, or was that system that supposedly they want to return to. It's kind of a very plastic conservatism, something like that, artificial tradition.
I do see as a plug for this book that the possibility of law is being shown. And he says we need to look not only at the Western legal tradition, of which this book is a great introduction, but comparative law, to try to convince people of the value of law and to have the resources to meet the current crisis. So maybe more people should be reading this book, and lawyers should be reading this book, and politicians should be reading this book. So at least they have on you know, they've got the, I can stay in power if I do X bird, and they've got the, oh wait, but there's this thing that I should be respecting called law. And then at least maybe there, when the opportunities for those two things to come together, it's more likely that you'll get something other than mere short-term politics, and something more like creative construction of a growing body of law.
I think that's a good place to end. I don't think you're gonna get any better comment than that.
I wanted to mention one thing, which is this idea that this is a spurious kind of idea, but the idea that he talks this whole time about law being something that's both material and ideological in almost a paradoxical way, and that this is coming out of the Christian legal tradition, and that the canon law is supposedly reflecting heaven, and the secular law is to the best of its ability reflecting the canon law. It has this other theological root in Christianity in just the idea of the incarnation, that the highest, most divine principle was made somehow material out of the same stuff as the rest of everything else. So the possibility of the incarnation is the possibility of law in a similar way. Not just the legal aspects of Christian theology, but the most core fundamental aspects of Christian theology. And what makes Christian theology unique, the most unique idea in Christianity, is the idea of the incarnation, and in addition to the idea of the Trinity. But yeah, those are also some key background things that I thought are just, those are just things to reflect on. They're not really theses, clear theses, but yeah. I guess thanks everyone for doing this all together. And I don't know, maybe in the future we'll hit Law and Revolution 2, but until then, we'll see you guys later. Bye.